September 4th, 1996. Radio City Music Hall. 13 million viewers watching live on MTV. Eddie Van Halen stood backstage, guitar in hand, believing this reunion performance would heal years of wounds between him and David Lee Roth. What he didn't know was that in exactly 7 minutes, Roth would speak 4 sentences that would publicly execute Eddie's dignity, destroy any chance of reconciliation, and cement the most humiliating moment in rock guitar history. The MTV Video Music Awards stage was about to become a slaughterhouse, and Eddie Van Halen was the sacrifice nobody saw coming. The irony was almost poetic. Eddie had spent 18 years revolutionizing rock guitar, creating the brown sound that redefined what 6 strings could do, engineering the Frankenstrat that became more iconic than most band logos. He'd recorded Eruption in 1 take, played the Beat It solo that bridged metal and pop, survived addiction that should have killed him twice. But none of that mattered now. Because in 1996, standing in that backstage corridor with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, Eddie was about to learn that your greatest enemy isn't the one who attacks you in private. It's the one who humiliates you in front of millions while pretending to celebrate you. David Lee Roth had been planning this for years, not consciously perhaps, but the resentment had been fermenting since 1985 when he left Van Halen, convinced he was the real star, the irreplaceable frontman, the reason those arena crowds screamed. 11 years later, his solo career had peaked and valleyed, while Van Halen with Sammy Hagar had continued selling out stadiums. Roth's ego needed vindication, and MTV was about to give him the perfect weapon disguised as a reunion opportunity. What nobody tells you about televised reunions is that they're controlled explosions. MTV knew exactly what they were doing when they contacted Eddie and Alex Van Halen separately from Roth, pitching this as a historic moment for the MTV generation, a chance to show the world that Van Halen could still bring the magic that defined 1984. Eddie hesitated. His relationship with Roth had been toxic even during their peak years together, filled with ego clashes, creative disagreements, and the kind of alpha male posturing that turns recording sessions into psychological warfare. But MTV executives worked their persuasion, reminding Eddie that millions of fans had grown up with the original Van Halen lineup, that this performance could rewrite the narrative, that maybe, just maybe, enough time had passed for maturity to replace animosity. Eddie agreed, but with conditions. This would be a straightforward performance. No drama, no speeches, just the music. They'd rehearse minimally, play 2 classic tracks, show the world that Van Halen's original lineup could still deliver. What Eddie didn't realize was that Roth had different plans entirely. Plans that involved no rehearsal, maximum drama, and a very public settling of scores that only Roth knew were coming. The rehearsal that never happened should have been the first warning sign. 3 days before the VMAs, Eddie and Alex showed up to the scheduled practice space in Manhattan. They waited 40 minutes. Roth never appeared. When they finally reached him by phone, he claimed scheduling conflicts, said they didn't need to rehearse songs they'd played 1,000 times, assured them everything would be fine on the night. Eddie felt the familiar knot in his stomach, the same intuition that had warned him during their final tour together in 1984 that something was fundamentally broken. But he pushed it down, told himself that Roth was probably just being Roth, that the actual performance would snap everyone into professional mode. If you've never experienced the unique anxiety of knowing someone in your past might destroy you but being powerless to prevent it, then please hit that subscribe button because this story gets so much darker, and you'll want to see how Eddie Van Halen survived what came next. September 4th arrived with that peculiar electricity that major televised events generate. Radio City Music Hall buzzed with celebrities, industry executives, and the MTV generation crowd that had made Van Halen's videos into cultural touchstones. Eddie arrived early, always the professional, always the one who took music seriously, even when everyone around him treated it like theater. He found his guitar tech, went through his standard pre-show ritual, checking the Frankenstrat's tuning 3 times, adjusting the Variac transformer to get that voltage sag just right, making sure the brown sound would translate through MTV's audio mix. Backstage was controlled chaos, artists moving between dressing rooms, producers shouting into headsets, makeup artists touching up faces that would be broadcast into millions of homes. Eddie spotted Michael Anthony, their bass player, who'd flown in specifically for this reunion moment. Anthony looked nervous, which wasn't like him. "You seen Dave?" he asked Eddie. Eddie shook his head. Roth was somewhere in the building, but he'd been avoiding the Van Halen brothers all afternoon, citing vocal warm-ups and meditation as reasons he couldn't meet before showtime. Alex Van Halen, Eddie's brother and drummer, had developed a sixth sense about Roth over their years together. "Something's wrong," he told Eddie an hour before they were scheduled to perform. "Dave's too quiet. When he's quiet, he's planning something." Eddie wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, but Alex knew Roth's patterns. The frontman was at his most dangerous when he withdrew, when he stopped his usual peacocking and grandiose gestures. That's when the real venom was brewing. What happened in the 30 minutes before they took the stage would later be described by insiders as painfully awkward. MTV had arranged a brief backstage photo opportunity, just the 4 original Van Halen members together for the first time since 1985. The photographer positioned them, David in the center naturally, Eddie to his left with the Frankenstrat, Alex behind the kit that had been set up for the photo, Michael with his bass. The camera clicked. Nobody smiled. Roth kept making jokes that landed with the energy of grenades in a chapel, comments about the old days that carried undertones only the band members understood. Eddie stayed silent, focusing on his guitar, running his fingers over the worn neck, finding comfort in the instrument that had never betrayed him. A production assistant approached with last-minute details. They'd perform 2 songs, Ain't Talkin' 'Bout Love, followed by an abbreviated version of Panama. Simple, classic, impossible to screw up. Except MTV had added something Eddie hadn't agreed to. Roth would have a live microphone for spontaneous banter between songs. Eddie's stomach dropped. Spontaneous banter with David Lee Roth was like handing a pyromaniac matches in a fireworks factory. He tried to object, but the assistant was already gone, the schedule was locked, and in television production, especially live television, there's no time for artist concerns once the machine is in motion. Roth appeared 15 minutes before showtime, wearing his signature smirk and an outfit that looked like it cost more than Eddie's first car. He didn't make eye contact with Eddie or Alex, instead working the backstage area like a politician at a fundraiser, shaking hands, throwing out one-liners, reminding everyone in proximity that he was David Lee Roth, the frontman, the star, the voice that had made Van Halen more than just a guitar virtuoso's backing band. Eddie watched this performance within a performance and felt the dread intensify. This wasn't the behavior of someone planning a simple reunion. This was someone setting a stage for something bigger. The lights in Radio City dimmed. 13 million people at home leaned toward their televisions. In the hall, the MTV generation crowd erupted as the Van Halen name appeared on the massive video screens. Eddie, Alex, and Michael took their positions on stage, and for exactly 90 seconds, Everything was perfect. The opening riff of Ain't Talkin' 'Bout Love cut through the hall with that unmistakable Van Halen energy. Eddie's fingers dancing across the Frankenstrat neck with muscle memory precision. Alex's drums locked in with the mathematical perfection that had defined their sound since they were teenagers practicing in their Pasadena garage. Even Roth seemed engaged, his vocals hitting the notes, his stage presence dialed up to arena-level charisma. But Eddie could feel it, that wrongness beneath the surface, the way Roth kept glancing at him between lyrics, with an expression that wasn't quite friendly, wasn't quite hostile, but definitely wasn't the look of a reunited bandmate celebrating shared history. The first song ended to massive applause. This should have been the moment that validated the reunion, that showed everyone Van Halen's magic was intact, despite the years and the acrimony. Instead, it was the moment David Lee Roth decided to detonate his carefully planned bomb. Roth grabbed the microphone, and instead of introducing the second song or making a gracious comment about the reunion, he paused. The pause lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4, but in live television, those seconds stretched into eternities. Eddie felt every muscle in his body tense. He knew. Somehow he knew what was coming wouldn't be good. Roth's smile widened. That particular smile he used when he was about to say something he found hilarious, but everyone else would find uncomfortable. "You know," Roth began, his voice carrying that theatrical quality that could fill stadiums, "I forgot the words to the second song." Nervous laughter from the audience. Eddie's grip on his guitar neck tightened. This wasn't Roth admitting a mistake. This was Roth setting up a punchline. "But that's okay," he continued, "because unlike some people, I don't need to hide behind a guitar to be interesting." The insult landed like a physical blow. 13 million viewers heard it. The Radio City audience heard it. Every music journalist in the building heard it. But most devastatingly, Eddie Van Halen heard it, standing 6 feet away from the man he'd co-founded one of the biggest rock bands in history with, being told on live television that his artistry, his revolutionary guitar work, the innovations that had changed rock music forever, were essentially him hiding. Eddie's face on the MTV broadcast became iconic for all the wrong reasons. The camera caught his expression in that moment. Shock, humiliation, rage, all flickering across his features before he forced them back into professional neutrality. Alex's drumsticks literally stopped mid-air. Michael Anthony looked at the floor, and Roth, sensing blood in the water, kept going. I mean, Eddie's great and all, fantastic guitarist, really virtuoso stuff, but you ever notice how he never talks, never does interviews, always lets the guitar do the talking? Another pause, another smile. Maybe it's because when you take away the instrument, there's not much left to say. What millions of viewers witnessed was public humiliation disguised as friendly ribbing. What the music industry witnessed was David Lee Roth destroying any possibility of a Van Halen reunion while simultaneously attempting to rewrite history, suggesting that Eddie's genius was somehow a limitation, that his legendary shyness and preference for letting his music speak was a character flaw rather than the natural temperament of an artist more comfortable with notes than words. The second song never happened. Not really. They played through Panama mechanically, all the joy and energy drained from the performance by Roth's verbal assault. Eddie's guitar work was technically perfect, because Eddie's guitar work was always technically perfect, but anyone watching could see the life had gone out of it. This was now an execution being completed, the condemned man fulfilling his contractual obligation before being led away. When the final note rang out, there was applause, because audiences applaud out of habit and expectation. But Backstage insiders later reported it felt hollow, like everyone knew they'd witnessed something terrible disguised as entertainment. Eddie walked off stage without acknowledging the crowd, without the traditional bows or waves. He went straight to his dressing room, guitar still in hand, and locked the door. Alex followed, pounding on the door, trying to talk to his brother, but Eddie wouldn't open it. Inside that small room, surrounded by mirrors and the artificial cheerfulness of backstage hospitality, Eddie Van Halen confronted a truth he'd been avoiding for years. His relationship with David Lee Roth wasn't just damaged, it was toxic in a way that no amount of time or success could heal. What Eddie didn't know in that moment, sitting alone while Radio City Music Hall continued its celebration of music television, was that Roth's words would echo for decades. Every interview Eddie gave from that point forward would reference the 1996 MTV incident. Every discussion of Van Halen's internal dynamics would point to that night as definitive proof that Roth and the Van Halen brothers could never coexist. Music journalists would dissect those 4 sentences like forensic analysts, debating whether Roth had planned the attack or if it was genuinely spontaneous cruelty. Within hours, the music industry's response machinery kicked into gear. Managers called managers. Record label executives who'd been hoping for a lucrative Van Halen reunion tour with the original lineup started making contingency plans. MTV, realizing they'd broadcast what was essentially a public relationship termination, began their own damage control, with VJs during subsequent programming trying to reframe the incident as rock and roll unpredictability, rather than what it actually was. One man's ego destroying another man's dignity for 13 million witnesses. Sammy Hagar, who had replaced Roth as Van Halen's frontman in 1985 and was still technically in the band at that point, watched the broadcast from his home in California and later admitted he felt vindicated. For years, Roth had suggested that Van Halen without him was somehow lesser, that Hagar was a replacement rather than an evolution. Now Roth had publicly demonstrated exactly why the Van Halen brothers had been willing to move forward without him. Because working with David Lee Roth meant accepting that at any moment, for any reason, he might choose his own ego over the collective good. The calls started coming to Eddie's hotel room around midnight. His manager, his lawyer, several music journalists wanting statements, even a few fellow musicians offering support. Eddie didn't answer any of them. He sat in that hotel room with the Frankenstrat across his lap, not playing, just holding it, finding comfort in the weight and familiarity of the instrument that had been his voice when words failed him. And words were failing him now. How do you explain to people that someone you created art with, someone you shared stages and studios and success with, had just used the biggest platform imaginable to tell the world you were essentially worthless without your instrument? What most people don't understand about public humiliation is that it's a form of violence. Not physical violence, but the kind that targets your sense of self-worth, your professional identity, your place in the world. Eddie Van Halen had spent his entire career battling the immigrant trauma of being the Dutch kid who couldn't speak English, who got bullied in Pasadena schools, who found his voice through music because verbal communication felt dangerous and unreliable. Roth's attack on MTV hadn't been random. Whether consciously or unconsciously, Roth had targeted Eddie's deepest vulnerability, the fear that without his guitar, he was invisible, insignificant, easily dismissed. In the days following the MTV debacle, Eddie did something he rarely did. He talked to a therapist. Not about addiction, which he'd addressed in previous treatment programs, but about this specific wound. The therapist helped him understand what people in abusive relationships often struggle to accept: that some people are incapable of celebrating others without simultaneously diminishing them. That Roth's need to be the star required making Eddie something less than a star. That this pattern had probably existed throughout their entire professional relationship, but had been masked by commercial success and the chaos of constant touring. Eddie also began to understand the strategic brilliance of Roth's attack. By framing it as humor, by delivering it with that characteristic Roth smile and showmanship, he'd created plausible deniability. If Eddie complained publicly, he'd look like someone who couldn't take a joke, who was too sensitive, who lacked the rock and roll toughness that the industry valorized. Roth had essentially created a trap where Eddie's only options were to silently absorb the humiliation or publicly defend himself and risk looking weak. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, disguised as spontaneous banter. The 1996 MTV incident didn't just end any possibility of a reunion. It fundamentally altered how Eddie Van Halen approached his career going forward. The man who'd already been interview-shy became even more reclusive. His trust in collaborative relationships, never robust to begin with after years of industry politics and personal betrayals, contracted further. When Van Halen eventually parted ways with Sammy Hagar in 1996, partly due to tensions that had nothing to do with the MTV incident, but were certainly exacerbated by it, Eddie retreated into his 550 home studio, where he could control every variable, where no one could ambush him with public humiliation. The incident also revealed something about the nature of fame and artistic partnership that rarely gets discussed. Eddie Van Halen and David Lee Roth had created something together that was greater than either of them individually. The original Van Halen sound, that perfect marriage of Eddie's revolutionary guitar work and Roth's charismatic showmanship, had defined late 70s and early 80s rock. But creating art together doesn't mean you share values, respect each other, or even like each other. Sometimes it just means your individual talents happen to align at the right cultural moment, and when that moment passes, all that's left is the resentment of people who feel trapped by each other's shadows. For David Lee Roth, the MTV incident was probably satisfying in the moment. He'd reasserted his dominance, reminded the world that he was the frontman, that Van Halen without him had been different even if commercially successful. But long-term, he'd confirmed what many had suspected: that his ego made genuine collaboration impossible, that working with Roth meant accepting that he would always prioritize his own mythology over collective success. Future reunion attempts, and there were several over the years, always foundered on the fundamental truth revealed that night at Radio City. Trust, once destroyed this publicly, this viciously, this deliberately, cannot be rebuilt. Eddie Van Halen died on October 6, 2020, without ever truly reconciling with David Lee Roth. They'd attempted professional collaborations in later years, carefully managed reunion tours with layers of contracts and handlers, designed to prevent exactly the kind of spontaneous cruelty that had marked the 1996 MTV performance. But the warmth was gone. The creative chemistry that had made early Van Halen special had been permanently poisoned by that September night when Roth chose his ego over his former bandmate's dignity. In the final analysis, the 1996 MTV incident matters not because of what it said about two individuals with conflicting personalities, but because of what it revealed about the dark side of creative partnerships. The same qualities that make someone a great performer, confidence bordering on arrogance, the ability to command attention, the refusal to be diminished, can also make them cruel, manipulative, willing to destroy others to maintain their own status. Eddie Van Halen learned this lesson in the most public way possible. Broadcast to 13 million people who watched him absorb humiliation in real time while maintaining the professional composure that had defined his entire career. The brown sound that Eddie created, that revolutionary tone that changed rock guitar forever, survived long after the MTV Humiliation faded from headlines. His innovations, the tapping technique, the Frankenstrat's stripped-down brutalism, the Variac transformer tricks that created voltage sag magic. These became the vocabulary that generations of guitarists learned as their foundation. David Lee Roth's words that night tried to reduce Eddie to someone hiding behind a guitar, but history proved otherwise. Eddie Van Halen wasn't hiding behind anything. He was speaking a language that transcended words, creating beauty and power and innovation through 6 strings and amplified electricity. And ultimately, that language spoke louder and lasted longer than any insult delivered on a temporary stage for temporary applause.